So the final panel of the symposium is dealing with the Vietnam War, and we have an interesting mixture of people that are here today with us. We have a couple of authors, 3 authors actually, and one guy who might write a book someday, maybe, we don't know yet. And one of the country's foremost scholars on the Vietnam War, Bob Schultzinger, down here on the end. He's written a couple of texts. One is called A Time for War, which is the United States and Vietnam, 1945 to 1975. That's the book that I always go to when I'm preparing anything that deals with the general history of the Vietnam War. Maybe even more important for today, he wrote another follow-up to that called A Time for Peace, which deals with how we understand the legacy of the Vietnam War and the memory of the Vietnam War. And he's going to help me out today by, we're going to listen to these gentlemen talk about their own experiences. We're going to listen to Jerry Doherty and Terry Rizzuti and Daryl Mudd talk a little bit about the process they went through of writing their books, capturing their own war experience in the form of a memoir in the case of Jerry, and novels in the case of Daryl and the case of Terry. And then Rick is going to give us a response as well based on his experience as a Vietnam War veteran. We're going to start off with Terry, who's going to come up to the front and talk a little bit about his novel called The Second Tour, about his time as a U.S. Marine. And I'm going to turn it over to him right now.
Thank you, Nathan.
Thanks.
I'm not used to wearing glasses, but I have to do this. I really thank you all for inviting me. This is a tremendous opportunity for me. I hope I have something of value to offer. When I look at myself and my history, I sometimes feel like I don't really have the credentials for something like that. I feel like I'm just someone that survived a particular war. Mine was called Vietnam, and got to come home and write about it. And whether what I've written is of value, I hope so, but that's going to be left to folks like yourselves. I'm a nervous wreck, I can tell you that. If I had done this yesterday morning, I'd have been gone by yesterday morning, right afterwards. I've been sweating for 2 days. All this talk about war just has me like this. You know, I'm not used to doing that. I'm used to writing about war, but when you write about war, you know, you can sit down and you can quit whenever you feel like it, you know, and you can walk away from it, come back to it when you feel like it again, walk away from it, come back. Well, for 2 days, I've sat over there, and I have just, my shirt is soaked. And so I'm very nervous about this. I've got 3 things I want to try to cover today. I want to say a little bit about my work. I want to say a little bit about why I think memory is questionable, perhaps especially war memory. And I want to say a little bit about how I think the Vietnam War should be remembered. My book is called The Second Tour. It's based on my only tour in Vietnam. And I have some postcards sitting up there for anyone that's interested in the ISBN number and that sort of thing. The second tour, I started it in 1984. So I came home from Vietnam in 67, started writing the book in 84. It took me 12 years before I could put it down and just say, I'm tired of jacking with it. I've had it. This is it. It's done. And I left it on my computer. I took a hard copy and I stuck it in a box in a storage room, and it sat there for the next 12 years until last year. I joined a website last year called authorsden.com and started putting all my stuff on Authors Den, mostly to have it all in one place so I could save it and make sure that it got passed to my daughter someday. And people started reading that manuscript to the second tour, and I started getting feedback that said, you know, you really ought to publish this. Well, I tried 12 years of trying to get it published, and I was tired of that game. It was expensive. I kept getting the same rejections, so I gave up on that, and I wasn't going to start that process again. And then someone said, maybe you should self-publish it. Well, I'd always thought of self-publishing as vanity publishing, so I had this bias about that. But I did some investigating and finally decided, what the heck. So I published it last year, and it was released on Veterans Day. It's been a tremendous financial failure. Okay? But it's led to opportunities like this, which are tremendous successes. So I'm very proud of it in many ways. If you're truly interested in how and why I wrote this book, I'm going to give you the short version here, but the long version is coming out, I think, in the next issue of War Literature and the Arts. I wrote an article. It's called Art as Therapy, the biography of a novel. I think it's called a commentary rather than an article, and it should be in the next issue of War, Literature, and the Arts. And I tried to relive the whole experience from the day I started writing it until I published it. But the short version is that it started as a dump, where in 1984, a couple of incidents triggered me just pouring memories down on paper. And I did that for months and weeks, and just day after day after day. Sometimes in the middle of the night, jump up and just pour a memory down. And it was driving my family crazy, especially my wife. It was causing havoc at work because I was writing it at work, and I was using the resources I had at work to have them type it up for me. So I had these versions coming back that I could work with and pass them back to people to type for me. I was out of control totally and completely. And this went on for quite some time, and I had this thing in front of me that I called the second tour. Actually, my initial name was Vietnam, the second tour. And I was trying to figure out, okay, now I've got this down here. Most of it doesn't make any sense. What do I do with it? And my background was in English literature. So I immediately started looking at it from that perspective. And I was weighing the option of memoir, a literary account. Memoir, literary account. Which way should I go? And then I asked myself, well, who's going to read a memoir of somebody named Terry Rizzuti? Nobody's ever heard of Terry Rizzuti. So what good is a memoir, is what I was thinking. I'm not saying this is correct thinking or logical thinking. It's just the way I was thinking. Didn't make any sense. I wasn't an officer over there. I wasn't a politician that came out of the Vietnam War. I wasn't a newscaster. I wasn't Vietnamese. There were a lot of books were coming out that were written by Vietnamese, and the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, their children, and all this stuff. I didn't fit into any of those categories, so I figured no one would read a memoir. So I thought, I'll take what I know about literature and apply it to this. I called it vomit at the time. It was just this garbage that was down on paper. I was trying to make sense of it. It was all mixed up. It was jumbled. Things didn't make. I had to sort it all through like a big puzzle, put things in certain orders, and then start playing with it. And I did that. And then there was a third phase where an old girlfriend that I'd written a bunch of letters to from Vietnam contacted me to go to I forget, one of my reunions, 20th reunion or something. 20th reunion. And I said, I don't like coming to the 20th high school reunion. And she said, why not? I said, I'm busy. I'm writing a book. And she said, well, what's the book about? And I said, Vietnam. And she said, I've got all your old letters. And I said, whoa. And so one thing led to another, and she sent me the letters, and there were like 95 of them. And I went, wow. And I started reading all these letters, cover to cover, I put them in postal order and read them, one letter at a time. And there were about 10 of them that I selected that made the points, some of the points I was trying to make in the novel. And so I inserted them in the right places. I had to change dates and stuff so that they fit with the novel, and that sort of thing. So that was like phase 3. Basically, the second tour was my attempt to answer the question, what was it like in Vietnam? But I also wanted to address the effect of what it was like. So in a sense, it's a case study of PTSD. The second tour is both my memory of war and my memory of how I dealt with the memory of war. The second tour is a Vietnam War novel, but it's a novel before it's about war. The war setting is just one aspect. It's a novel of the human spirit, tried and sometimes broken. It's a novel of the human condition first, and a Vietnam War novel second. Its primary audience includes families of combat vets, readers of literature, and academic types. It's not an easy read. Family members trying to understand combat vets will benefit from reading this book. Readers of novels and professors of literature can find value here too. It's not stream of consciousness. It's not modernist. It's not associational. And yet it's all of those and more. Readers will be rewarded by the way I've used form as a tool in the telling of my story. Professors of behavioral sciences can approach this book as a path to an understanding of PTSD. A psych professor should see the value of walking students through the lived experience of the protagonist and discussing the impact of that experience on the internal and social functionality of the person for whom such experience has an ongoing effect. A sociology professor should easily be able to discuss the effect of such experience on a person at the microsocial level, and then move to some perceptions of how a generation of persons with such experience then affects social trends in a society. Social work professors can use the book as a primer on PTSD, a way to jumpstart first-year students into an understanding of combat's effect. Some history professors set war in its historical context at the macro level. Others show us human stories at the micro level. In my experience, the best history does both. This book is a slice of history at the micro level. That's pretty much all I want to say about the book right now. I'd like to turn for just a couple minutes about some of my other stuff, mostly short stories, but also novels. I've got one short story called Willis. Willis is about a homeless vet and a street cop. I was really interested in homelessness among Vietnam vets, so I tried to write a story about that. And it was published in War Literature and the Arts in 2004. I also wrote a story called Bruno that was published in Eclectica magazine, an online magazine, in 2006. And it's about the obsessive compulsiveness component of PTSD in a combat veteran. It's one of my favorite stories, and all these things are available on authorsden.com. You can just download them and read them. Bruno, or you can access them in the case of a published work. You can just go straight to the journal where they are. Bruno is one of my favorites because the story came to me from a guy I was doing group therapy with. And he took me aside one night and he told me this story about how he was a cop in Oklahoma City and had been a cop ever since he had gotten back from Vietnam. And he had a Bronze Star with V for Valor. Pretty well decorated ex-Marine turned cop. And he went home one day after work and caught his wife being raped by his best friend. And he was in group therapy because he froze when he saw what his friend was doing to his wife. He absolutely froze and could not do anything. And his buddy got up off his wife and walked past him out the door, he said. He told me the story. And I went, wow, that's a story. So I took that little kernel and turned it into a story. And I, like I said, I kind of like it. I have another story called Walls, which is scheduled for publication in Connecticut Review next fall in a special issue called Veterans and War. Walls is kind of a neat story because, you know, we've talked a lot in here about how we couldn't talk about it when we got home. And that's very true of combat vets. And it was true of me for years and years and years and years and years. And I was interested in what would happen if the woman you were married to threw up a wall that you couldn't penetrate. So here she can't penetrate your wall. What happens if you can't penetrate hers? And so the idea I came up with was take a woman who won't take her bra off during sex. And that's what the story's about. You know, the two characters are Bobby and Peg, and they get into these constant arguments where Bobby's going, take off the bra, Peg. Tell me about the war, Bobby. And they go back and forth until they wind up divorced because they just can't communicate. And then a fourth one that I wrote is called Out of Step, Out of Time. And this is something we haven't really talked in here about yet. The whole issue of Vietnam vets who not only feel like they're out of step with their peers, their civilian peers, but they also feel like they're out of step with the veterans of the previous wars. And this was very true for us for a long number of years. When I came home from Vietnam, I was kicked out of VFWs, I was kicked out of American Legions because I was a Vietnam veteran. And I was very angry about that. And I ran into the same thing when I was living in Oklahoma, in a small town called Shawnee, Oklahoma, where when the first Vietnam vet was elected commander of that post, every World War II and Korean War vet got up and walked out. And most of them, the vast majority, never came back again. And that bothered me. And so I wrote a story about it. My own father, a World War II vet, called me a loser at one point. And I said, what do you mean, a loser? He said, well, we won our war. And he and I got into it for years over that. And this was long before they came up with the term greatest generation, and I might have been able to throw that back at him and saying, it was your generation that sent us over there. You know, that's how angry I was about a lot of these issues. And so I worked out my anger in stories. I would just write these stories because they have therapeutic value. They calm you. They clarify your thinking and your feelings. And I find that healthy, and that's why I turned to writing. Because I have never been a suicidal personality, but I have definitely been homicidal in my thinking. I've never done that, except in a war zone. But I've always felt that way, that before I go down, I'm taking some folks with me. That's the attitude that I've had for years and years and years. And I think a lot of Vietnam vets feel like that. Let's skip to this issue of memory and how I have, in my recent years, started thinking of it as kind of tricky or iffy. Especially this year. I've thought a lot about the issue of memory. I'm not sure I trust my memory anymore. For example, consider this. Whenever we got ready for patrol, when they'd say, saddle up, we're moving out, we throw our gear on, we get ready to go, my mind would immediately start working on worst case scenarios. And when we were out on patrol, and this was especially true if I was walking point or if I was tail end Charlie, my mind was thinking of every possible wrong thing that could happen. And what I ask myself today is, do any of those imaginings that I concocted, did any of them work their way into my consciousness as true stories? I don't know the answer to this, but it's something I've been wondering about. Or consider this. I had this friend, let's call him Herb. Herb and I, whenever we got to the rear, we were only allowed 2 beers. We called it the rear. There was no rear in Vietnam, but there were areas that we considered the rear. In our particular area, the rear was called Phu Bai. Whenever we get back to Phu Bai, we were allowed 2 beers. That's it, a piece. 2 beers. Okay? Couldn't get drunk on 2 beers. We tried. It just couldn't be done. Okay? And so Herb and I would get upset about this. So one day we went to the company clerk and we said, is there any way we could break this rule? And he says, no. And as we were walking out the door, he said, you know, I heard that over in the air wing you can get all the beer you want. So, wow, you know, we were pretty smart. We headed for the air wing. Now, we just got back off patrol the first time this happened, so we're filthy. And we walked into the air wing, enlisted men's club, and we sat down, we ordered a beer. Before we knew it, we were surrounded by air wingers. And one of them said, tell us a war story. And I went, what do you mean? Well, you know, man, we never get to go out in the field. Tell us a war story. And you know what they were asking. They wanted to hear about a firefight. Okay? They wanted to know what it was like to be in combat. And so Herb starts telling the story, you know, and I'm sitting there and I'm listening to Herb tell this story, and I'm going, wait a minute, I don't remember that. You know? And he gets and he's going and he's going, and he's getting right to that point where it's time for the firefight, and he turns to me and he says, hey, Rudy, finish the story. Rudy was my nickname. And I said, finish the story? It's your story. He goes, no, man, I can't finish it. You got to finish the story. So I finished the story. Okay? Now, this went on for a couple of months. Every time we got to the rear, we'd hightail it over to the Air Wing Club. We'd sit down, and they'd start buying us beer for stories. And that's what I've titled my paper, War Stories for Beer. Because it worked. We could tell these, oh, I'm telling you, we made up some whoppers. And they bought us beer. And we could drink, get drunk, and go back, and it was all worth it to us. But what I ask myself today is, did any of those stories we concocted, did any of them work their way into my consciousness as real stories? I don't know the answer to that. Or how about this? Remember those letters I told you about that my girlfriend had saved and sent to me, like 95 of them? Well, when my book got published last year, she got wind of it. And she emailed me and said, you know, I've got a bunch more letters. I said, what? She said, I got about 70 more letters. I said, you're kidding. So she sent me 70 more letters. Well, what I've discovered in the process of reading these 70 more letters is that I have totally forgotten the second half of my tour in Vietnam. The last 6 months of my tour are almost gone. Not only that, but the first 9 or 10 months of after I came home are gone. What does that tell you? You know, what does that mean? Well, to me it's scary. What it tells me is that this book I wrote is all about the first half of my tour. There's very little in here that came from the second half of the tour, because I can't remember it. I have 4 incidents that I recall from the second half of my tour. One was a war crime. One was getting wounded. One was my closest friend getting to go home 3 months before I could, and that was very traumatic for me because we were so close, and he had kept me alive for a long time. And then going home. I remember those, and maybe some really tiny details in between. But what's really strange to me is that I can read the after-action reports, and there's nothing there from the second half of my tour. I can read the U.S. Marines in Vietnam in '67, look at the order of battle for my outfit, and I go, wow, I did that? I don't remember that, you know? I can read my squad leader's citation for the Navy Cross. That's my squad leader now. We're talking 8 guys together, and one of them's the squad leader. And he got the Navy Cross, and I barely remember it. What does that say to us? Another way in which memory is tricky to me is that most of what I remember is the bad stuff, the depressing stuff, the violence and the fear. I hardly remember any of the funny stuff, none of it. I mean, except this incident I just told you about her. And I had to really work at bringing that story up just for this talk. I had no funny stories prior to coming here for this talk. The Herb story of, you know, War Stories for Beer is my only funny story. And yet I know we laughed like crazy over the stupidest, funniest stuff the whole time I was there. And I have friends who only remember the happy stuff, the good things that happened. They don't remember the bad stuff. Okay, what does that say about us as personalities? I don't know the answer to that. Okay, quickly. I think, in fact I know, psychological blurring can bring historical blurring, not only for an individual, but perhaps also for a nation that experiences war year after year after year. In fact, trauma can actually erase memory or somehow hide it from consciousness. I think that with real personal trauma, what we have to trust is not memory so much, since it comes through a biased perception, but the more basic phenomenon of consciousness itself. Not consciousness in the sense of wakefulness, but in the sense of sanity. If the mind says that we should lose something, in other words, I trust it to know that we should. I am believing more and more that sanity is kind of an off and on, iffy sort of construct that is one of many necessary cognitive conditions. Do I have a point here? Only that memories are never lost. The mind simply files things in ways of their necessary use. I evidently have no use now for some of my war memories. So maybe it's time to just let them go, and that's not an easy task for a combat vet. My last thing I'd like to do is just make some statements on what I think we ought to take away from the Vietnam War. And I'm reminded of something Alex said yesterday, I don't know if he's still here or not, that it's depressing when you try to look at what you should take away from a war. And I think he might be correct, as you might notice here. I believe Vietnam was a watershed moment in American history, a time of great turmoil and disillusion, a time when America turned against its warriors, a time when veterans of one war turned against veterans of another, a time when a tiny country with no air or ground superiority stood down the most powerful nation on earth, a time when many Americans, including veterans, lost trust in government and many other institutions, a time of being drafted and dodging the draft, a time of war at home between Vietnam supporters and protesters that played out in our post-war politics for 30 years. A time of witnessing and interpreting war by means of television screens and news commentary. A time when veterans in large numbers had the courage to admit their mental struggles and PTSD became a household acronym. A time when the American military won its battles but lost the war, and that loss turned into a debilitating syndrome that America believed could only be addressed by flexing its military muscle, and so it did. A time when America sent its children into a situation where problems of racism and social stratification had to be set aside, and 19-year-olds were forced to embrace each other as brothers or simply die. And still, they died, some 59,000 of them. A time when a sitting president stepped down and his successor was impeached and later pardoned by his successor. A time when America looked in the mirror and didn't like what it saw.